This is the story of a 12-year-old princess who vanished for a year on the back of the largest dragon in the world. When she came home, she was burning from the inside, struck by a fever no maester could name. And beneath her skin, they saw a movement, things that should not exist. Where did Balerion carry her in that missing year? What did the maesters witness in her final hours? And why did the wisest minds in Westeros fail to save her or even explain what happened? If you've only watched the show, you've never heard this story. But once you do, you'll understand why this is the darkest chapter in Targaryen history. Let's begin. Before the flight, before the fever, before the things inside her, there was a girl. Her name was Aerea Targaryen, and she was born into a family that was tearing itself apart. She came into the world in the year 42 after Aegon's conquest, at a time when the Targaryen dynasty was still young, still finding its shape. The family that had conquered the Seven Kingdoms with 3 dragons was now facing something perhaps more dangerous than any army. A struggle over succession, over who deserved to rule, over what the future of their house would look like. Aerea was the daughter of Prince Aegon Targaryen and Princess Rhaena Targaryen. Her parents were brother and sister, married in the ancient tradition of Old Valyria. For thousands of years before the Doom, the Dragon Lord families of Valyria had married within their own bloodlines to keep their connection to dragons strong. It was believed that the ability to bond with dragons, to ride them and command them, lived in the blood. Mixing that blood with outsiders might dilute the gift, might weaken the bond. So the Targaryens, like the Valyrians before them, married brother to sister and to cousin, keeping the bloodline as pure as possible. Aerea had a twin sister named Rhaella. The 2 girls were born together, grew together, and from their earliest moments were caught in the same web of politics and power that defined their family. Their father, Prince Aegon, was called Aegon, the Uncrowned. He never sat on the Iron Throne, though many believed he should have. He was the eldest son of King Aenys I, which should have made him heir. But when King Aenys died, it was not Aegon who took the crown. Instead, it was Aenys's younger brother, Maegor the Cruel, as history would remember him, seized the throne through force and fear. He was a warrior, brutal and effective, and he believed the realm needed strength, not the gentler hand that Aegon might have offered. Prince Aegon challenged Maegor's claim. He declared himself the rightful king and rode to battle to prove it. The conflict came to a head in a trial by combat, a fight between Aegon on his dragon Quicksilver and Maegor on the massive Balerion. It was not a fair fight. Quicksilver was young and small compared to the Black Dread. The battle ended quickly and terribly. Maegor killed both, dragon and rider. Prince Aegon fell from the sky, and with him fell any hope that his claim might succeed. Aerea was just a small child when her father died. She would have few memories of him, perhaps none at all. What she knew of him came from stories, from her mother's grief, from the way people spoke his name with a mix of respect and sadness. He had been brave. He had fought for what he believed was right, and he had lost everything. Her mother Rhaena survived that loss, but it marked her deeply. Rhaena had loved her brother husband. She had believed in his claim. When he died, she was left a widow with 2 young daughters and no clear path forward. She was a dragon rider herself, bonded to a dragon named Dreamfire, and she was one of the most formidable women of her time. But even her strength could not change the fact that Maegor now ruled, and she and her daughters were at his mercy. What happened next surprised everyone. Maegor, desperate for an heir of his own and having failed to produce children with any of his other wives, married Rhaena. It was a strange match, a political calculation wrapped in the customs of their house. Rhaena became queen, though she had little love for the man who had killed her first husband. And in a move that shocked the realm, Maegor named young Aerea as his heir. She was not his daughter by blood, but she was a Targaryen, and in the absence of any children of his own, she would do. For a brief moment, Aerea Targaryen was the heir to the Iron Throne. She was just a little girl, maybe 4 or 5 years old, and suddenly the entire realm was watching her. Lords bent their knees to her, courtiers tried to win her favor, or more accurately, tried to win the favor of those who controlled her. She was a piece on a board, a symbol of continuity, a promise that the Targaryen line would continue even if Maegor himself never had children. But Aerea did not understand any of this. She was too young. She played with her sister, learned her letters, and lived in the Red Keep under the watchful eyes of maesters and servants. The politics swirling around her were invisible, intangible, something she would only come to understand later, when it was too late to matter. Maegor's reign did not last. He was found dead in the year 48 AC, slumped on the Iron Throne with his wrists slashed and blood pooling around him. The throne itself, that jagged seat made from 1,000 swords, had cut him in a dozen places as he died. Some said he had taken his own life, unable to bear the weight of his failures. Others whispered that he had been murdered, that someone had slipped into the throne room and ended him. Still others believed it was divine judgment, that the gods had punished him for his cruelty. The truth remains unknown. What mattered was that Maegor was dead, and the realm needed a new king. The crown did not pass to Aerea. She had been Maegor's chosen heir, yes, but Maegor's word died with him. The lords of Westeros looked around for a better option, someone with a stronger claim, someone older, someone who could rule immediately without a regency. They found that person in Aerea Targaryen, Maegor's nephew. Jaehaerys was the younger brother of Prince Aegon, the man Maegor had killed. He had been in hiding during Maegor's reign, protected by loyalists who believed he was the true heir. Now, with Maegor gone, Jaehaerys emerged and claimed the throne. He was 14 years old, clever, determined, and already showing signs of the wisdom that would define his long reign. The lords accepted him. The faith of the Seven blessed him. And just like that, Aerea's brief moment as heir to the throne was over. She was set aside, pushed back into the ranks of ordinary Targaryen princesses, important but not essential, honored but not powerful. Her mother, Rhaena, did not accept this easily. Rhaena believed that Aerea still had a claim. After all, Maegor had named her. That should count for something. But the realm had moved on. Jaehaerys was king now, and he was good at being king. He made peace with the lords who had opposed his family. He reconciled with the faith, ending years of bloody conflict between the crown and the church. He built roads, reformed laws, and worked tirelessly to bring stability to a kingdom that had been torn apart by Maegor's brutality. People called him Jaehaerys, the conciliator, the king who healed wounds. But for Rhaena and Aerea, there was no healing. There was only loss. Rhaena watched as her daughter's future was taken away, replaced with a quieter, smaller life. Aerea was no longer the heir. She was simply another princess in a castle full of royals, expected to be obedient, to marry well, to support the king rather than compete with him. The tension between Rhaena and King Jaehaerys simmered for years. It was never open conflict. Rhaena was too smart for that, and Jaehaerys too careful. But everyone at court knew there was bitterness there, a sense that something had been stolen and could never be returned. Aerea grew up in that atmosphere, watching her mother's frustration, feeling the weight of expectations she could not meet. She was a quiet girl, from what the histories tell us, not rebellious in the obvious ways, not the sort to throw tantrums or make dramatic declarations. But she was not content either. She watched as other Targaryen children bonded with dragons, claiming the great beasts as their own. Her mother had Dreamfire, King Jaehaerys had Vermithor, his sister wife, Queen Alysanne, had Silverwing. Dragons were everywhere in the family, symbols of power and identity. But Aerea had none. For a Targaryen, not having a dragon was like being incomplete. It meant you were lesser, weaker, not quite living up to the legacy of your name. The ability to bond with a dragon was proof of your bloodline, proof that you carried the ancient magic of Valyria in your veins. Without that bond, you were just a person with a famous name. Aerea wanted a dragon. She needed one, and she knew exactly where to find one. But Aerea was not content to be a pawn. She had her own plan. She had watched the adults around her make decisions about her life for years. She had been named heir, then discarded. She had been promised importance, then given obscurity. She had been told she was special, then treated as ordinary. And she was tired of waiting for someone else to decide what her life would be. Dragons were kept on Dragonstone, the ancient Targaryen fortress, built on a volcanic island in Blackwater Bay. It was where the family had first lived when they fled Valyria, the place where they had waited and watched before Aegon, the conqueror, decided to invade Westeros. The castle was carved into the mountain itself, shaped like dragons in stone, with towers that looked like worms and walls that seemed to breathe. It was a dark, powerful place, heavy with history and magic. In the caves beneath Dragonstone, dragons roosted. Some were bonded to riders, Others were wild, or waiting, or too young to be claimed. The dragon keepers, men whose families had served the Targaryens for generations, tended to the beasts, feeding them, watching them, making sure they did not turn on each other, or escape to terrorize the nearby islands. It was dangerous work. Dragons were not pets. They were intelligent, powerful, and utterly unpredictable. Even a trained dragon could kill its keeper if the mood struck. And then there was Balerion, and that plan began with the largest dragon alive. Balerion had been riderless since Maegor's death. Ancient, massive, still dangerous. The Black Dread was a living legend. He had been born in Valyria before the Doom, which made him over 200 years old by the time Aerea knew of him. He was the last living creature to have seen the Valyrian freehold at its height, the last to remember the world as it had been before everything burned. Balerion's size was almost impossible to imagine. His skull alone, which would eventually be displayed in the Red Keep after his death, was so large that a horse and rider could pass through his open jaws without touching the teeth. His wingspan could cover entire fields. When he flew overhead, his shadow was like night falling in the middle of the day. Towns would go dark as he passed over. Children would scream, and people would run indoors, afraid even though the dragon was far above them. His scales were black, so black they seemed to drink in light. His eyes were like molten gold, ancient and knowing. His fire burned hotter than any other dragon's, hot enough to melt stone, to turn sand into glass, to reduce a man to ash in seconds. When Aegon the Conqueror had used Balerion during his wars to forge the Seven Kingdoms, the dragon had burned entire castles. Harrenhal, the greatest fortress in Westeros, had been destroyed by Balerion's flames. Its towers had melted like candles, and the stones still bore the black marks of that, burning 100 years later. After Aegon died, Balerion had been claimed by Maegor, and Maegor had used the dragon to enforce his brutal rule, to crush rebellions, to terrify anyone who opposed him. When Maegor fought Prince Aegon in the sky, it had been Balerion who killed the younger dragon Quicksilver. The battle had lasted only moments. Balerion was so much larger, so much more powerful, that the outcome had never been in doubt. But after Maegor's death, Balerion had no rider. The dragon had returned to Dragonstone and taken up residence in the deepest, darkest caves. He rarely emerged, and when he did, the dragon keepers gave him a wide berth. He was old now, perhaps nearing the end of his life, though no one knew how long dragons could live. He was slower than he had been, more prone to sleep than flight. But he was still enormous, still dangerous, still the most fearsome creature in the known world. No one had tried to claim him. It would have been foolish. Balerion had been Aegon's dragon, then Maegor's. Both had been warriors, men of strength and will. What child could command such a beast? What young rider could bond with a dragon that had seen empires fall and kings die? The common wisdom was that Balerion would never accept another rider, that he would live out his remaining years alone and die unmounted. Aerea did not care about common wisdom. She was 11 years old, and she had made her decision. She would claim Balerion. She would show everyone that she was not just some forgotten princess, not just a pawn in someone else's game. She would prove that she was a true Targaryen, a dragon rider, someone who mattered. She did not tell anyone her plan. She did not ask her mother for permission or advice. She did not consult the maesters or dragon keepers. She simply went to Dragonstone, walked into the caves where Balerion slept, and climbed onto his back. What went through her mind in that moment, we can only guess. Was she afraid? She must have been. Standing before a creature that size, feeling the heat radiating from his body, seeing those massive eyes open and fix on her, it would terrify anyone. But fear and courage are not opposites. Courage is doing something despite the fear. And Aerea was courageous. Balerion did not eat her. He did not burn her. He did not shake her off his back or crush her with a claw. He simply accepted her. Perhaps he sensed something in her, some determination or strength that reminded him of his previous riders. Perhaps he was simply old enough not to care, willing to fly one more time for someone who dared to ask. Or perhaps dragons, in their ancient wisdom, saw something in Aerea that humans could not. No one saw her leave. No one heard the dragon roar. She was simply gone. The dragon keepers went to the caves the next morning for the daily feeding and found Balerion's roosting spot empty. They searched the other caves, thinking perhaps he had moved, but he was nowhere on the island, and when they checked the castle, they discovered that Princess Aerea was missing too. The realization came slowly, then all at once. The little princess had claimed the Black Dread, and now both were gone. The search lasted weeks, then months, but Aerea and Balerion had vanished completely. The court erupted into chaos. How does something that size disappear? Balerion was not a small dragon that could hide in a forest or a mountain valley. He was enormous, distinctive, impossible to miss. If he flew anywhere near civilization, someone would see him. If he landed anywhere, someone would report it. And yet there was nothing, no sightings, no rumors, no word at all. King Jaehaerys ordered a full search. Ships sailed up and down the coast, looking for any sign of the dragon. Riders on smaller dragons flew search patterns over the ocean and the mainland. Ravens went out to every castle, every town, every village in the Seven Kingdoms, asking if anyone had seen Balerion or the princess. Rewards were offered for information. Prayers were said in the Sept of Baelor and in every holy place in the realm. Rhaena was frantic. She flew on Dreamfire herself, searching the coasts and islands, calling out her daughter's name over empty waters. She offered her own rewards, promised favors to anyone who could bring news. She could not eat, could not sleep. Her other daughter, Rhaella, tried to comfort her, but there was no comfort to be found. Aerea was gone, and every day that passed made it less likely she would ever return. Some in the court began to speculate. Had Aerea run away? Was this an act of rebellion, a rejection of the life she had been given? Had she fled to Essos, to one of the free cities where Targaryens might live without the pressures of Westeros? There were Targaryen exiles in the east, distant cousins and cadet branches of the family who had left over the generations. Perhaps Aerea had gone to find them, to start a new life away from the crown and the court and the disappointments. Others feared she was dead. Dragons were dangerous, even to their riders. Perhaps Balerion had turned on her mid-flight, thrown her off, or burned her by accident. Perhaps they had crashed into the ocean, pulled down by a sudden storm. Perhaps she had simply lost control, and the dragon had flown somewhere inhospitable, a frozen wasteland, a desert, a place where no human could survive. The possibilities were endless, and almost all of them ended in tragedy. But no one guessed the truth. No one thought to look toward Valyria. For an entire year, Aerea Targaryen and the Black Dread were gone. No word, no sighting, no sign of life. In that silence, the court began to imagine where she might be. The human mind cannot tolerate mystery. When faced with the unknown, we create stories, possibilities, explanations that might make sense of the senseless. And so the court told itself stories about Aerea. Maybe she had gone to Essos and was living in Pentos or Volantis, walking through markets disguised as a common girl, free from the weight of her name. Maybe she had found a Valyrian family in one of the free cities, descendants of other Dragonlord houses who had survived the doom, and they had taken her in. Maybe she was learning their customs, their language, becoming someone new. Maybe she had flown north, beyond the wall, into the lands of endless ice where the wildlings lived. There were stories of warm springs in the far north, hidden valleys where people survived despite the cold. Maybe she had found such a place and made it her home. Maybe she would return one day with tales of giants and direwolves, of the strange magic that still lived in the oldest parts of the world. Maybe she had gone south instead, across the summer sea to the jungles of Sothorios. That land was largely unexplored, a place of ruins and mystery where even the bravest sailors feared to go. Diseases killed travelers there within days, and the natives were said to be more beast than human. But maybe Aerea and Balerion had found a way to survive, living among the ruins of civilizations that had fallen long before Valyria ever rose. The maesters studied their maps and shook their heads. The dragon keepers offered their own theories, based on years of watching dragons and learning their patterns. Dragons were territorial, they said. Balerion might have flown to some distant place and claimed it as his own, driving away any other creatures that lived there. He might be roosting on some forgotten island, feeding on whales and sharks, content to live out his final years, far from human civilization. But as the months passed, hope faded. The search parties returned empty-handed. The rewards went unclaimed. The ravens brought no news. Slowly, quietly, people began to speak of Aerea in the past tense. The maesters began to discuss whether a formal declaration of death should be made. King Jaehaerys commissioned prayers for her soul. Rhaena still searched, still hoped, but even she began to accept that her daughter might truly be gone forever. The realm moved on, as realms always do. There were other concerns, other crises. King Jaehaerys had a kingdom to run, laws to make, problems to solve. Aerea's disappearance became a sad story, a cautionary tale about the dangers of dragons and the foolishness of children. She was remembered, but she was also fading, becoming more memory than person. And then, on a still morning in 57 AC, Balerion returned. And then, on a summer morning in the year 57 after Aegon's conquest, Balerion came home, but the girl on his back was barely alive. The guards saw the shadow first, a shape too large to be anything but Balerion. He appeared over the eastern horizon, flying low over Blackwater Bay toward King's Landing. His wings beat slowly, irregularly, like he was struggling to stay in the air. Dragons did not struggle. Dragons were grace and power incarnate, masters of the sky. But Balerion struggled. The guards called out, warnings. They rang bells, alerted the castle, sent runners to the king. Within minutes, everyone in the Red Keep knew the Black Dread had returned. And if Balerion had returned, then perhaps Princess Aerea had too. People rushed to the yards and walls to see. Courtiers, servants, maesters, soldiers, anyone who could find a vantage point stopped what they were doing and looked up. They watched as the massive dragon descended, his shadow sweeping across the city. They watched as he flew lower and lower, approaching the castle grounds. And they watched as he landed, hard in one of the outer yards, the impact shaking the ground like a small earthquake. Balerion landed and did not move again. He folded his wings with what seemed like great effort. His head drooped toward the ground. His breathing was labored, loud enough to hear from dozens of feet away. The dragon keepers approached cautiously, not sure what to expect. And then they saw Aerea. She was slumped over Balerion's neck, her arms wrapped around the base of one of his great horns, as if she had been holding on for dear life. She was not moving. For a terrible moment, the keepers thought she was dead. But then they heard her make a sound, a soft whimper, weak and pained. She was alive, barely. Aerea did not dismount. She could not. Her body seemed locked in place, frozen in the hunched position. The keepers called for help, for ropes and blankets and gentle hands. They climbed onto Balerion's back, moving carefully, aware that the dragon might react badly to their presence. But Balerion did nothing. He just lay there, his golden eyes half closed, his breathing rough. They had to pry Aerea's hands loose from the horn. Her fingers were locked, stiff, like she had been holding on for so long that her body had forgotten how to let go. When they finally freed her and lifted her down, they gasped. She was burning, hot enough that the men who carried her recoiled from her skin. They wrapped her in cloth to protect their hands, but even through the fabric, they could feel the unnatural heat radiating from her body. Her clothes were in tatters, barely more than rags. Her hair was wild, matted, streaked with ash or dirt or something darker. Her skin was pale where it was not flushed with fever. Her lips were cracked and bleeding. Her eyes were open but unfocused, staring at nothing. She looked like she had been through something beyond description, like she had seen things that no human was meant to see. They carried her into the Red Keep, moving as quickly as they dared. People backed away as they passed, shocked by the sight of her. The princess who had vanished a year ago, the girl everyone had given up for dead, was back. But she looked more like a ghost than a living person. The maesters came at once, but this was no fever they had ever seen. Grand Maester Bennifer was the first to arrive, followed by Septon Barth and several others. Barth was not just a maester, but a scholar of the highest order, a man who had studied everything from medicine to dragon lore to the histories of Essos. If anyone could understand what was happening to Aerea, it was him. They took her to a private chamber, one that could be sealed and guarded. They laid her on a bed and began their examination, and immediately they knew something was terribly wrong. The masters had seen every illness in the known world. This was not one of them. They had treated grayscale, the disease that turned skin to stone. They had seen the shaking sickness, the bloody flux, the pale mare. They had dealt with infections that turned skin black, fevers that boiled the brain, poisons that stopped the heart. They had studied plagues that killed thousands and strange ailments that affected only one person in a generation. Their training was comprehensive. their knowledge vast, and none of it prepared them for what they saw in Aerea Targaryen. Her temperature was impossibly high. When they placed their hands near her skin, not even touching, just hovering above, they could feel waves of heat. It was like standing too close to a forge, like the air itself was burning. One of the maesters tried to touch her forehead and pulled back with a cry of pain. Even brief contact was enough to hurt. But she was not sweating. That was the first thing that made no sense. When the body overheats, it sweats. It is the body's way of cooling itself, of preventing damage to the organs and brain. Sweat evaporates and takes heat with it. Every maester knew this. Every peasant knew this. It was basic knowledge, as fundamental as breathing. But Aerea's skin was dry, fever hot, but dry. Her body was not trying to cool itself. The heat was simply there, burning from within, with no outlet and no relief. Her breathing was rapid and shallow. Her heart raced, beating so fast that the maesters could see her pulse jumping in her neck. But her blood pressure was low. She was weak, fading, her body struggling to function under conditions it was never meant to endure. And yet, she was alive. Somehow, impossibly, she was still alive. They tried everything they knew. They gave her water, drop by drop, trying to get fluids into her body. She could barely swallow. Most of it dribbled out of her mouth, running down her chin. They opened the windows and doors, letting the summer air flow through the chamber. It made no difference. They removed her tattered clothing, leaving her covered only by a thin sheet, hoping her body would release some of the heat. The sheet grew warm to the touch within minutes. She begged for ice. Her voice was so weak they had to lean close to hear it. "Ice," she whispered. "Please. Ice." The word came out broken, desperate. So they sent for ice, as much as could be found in the castle stores. The Red Keep kept ice year-round, harvested from mountain lakes in winter and stored in deep cellars packed with straw. It was expensive, reserved for the wealthy and the royal family. But for Princess Aerea, they brought all they had. They packed blocks of ice around her body. They placed them under her arms, behind her neck, along her sides. For a brief moment, she seemed to find relief. Her whimpering quieted. Her breathing slowed. The maesters exchanged hopeful glances. Perhaps the ice would work. Perhaps if they could just bring her temperature down, they could stabilize her, give her body a chance to fight whatever infection or illness had taken hold. But then the ice began to melt. At first, it seemed normal. Ice melts, especially in summer. But this was too fast. The blocks shrank visibly, water pooling around her body, dripping off the bed onto the floor. Within minutes, the ice was half gone. Within 10 minutes, it was reduced to slushy water. They brought more ice, packing it around her again and again. It melted just as quickly every time. They tried snow, brought down from the mountains by riders who pushed their horses to exhaustion. They packed her in snow, surrounded her with it, buried her beneath it. She begged for ice. They packed her in snow. It melted within minutes. The water that pooled around her was warm, almost hot. Steam rose from the bed in thin wisps, visible in the cooler air of the chamber. The maesters stared in disbelief. This was not possible. The human body could not generate this much heat. There was no disease, no condition, no poison that did this. Barth wrote furiously, documenting everything. The amount of ice used, the rate of melting, the temperature of the water, the sound of Aerea's breathing, the color of her skin. He described how her lips moved, forming words that made no sense, in languages he did not recognize. He noted the way her eyes tracked things that were not there, following invisible movements across the ceiling. And then they saw her skin move, something shifting beneath the surface. At first, the maesters thought it was a trick of the light, a shadow cast by the candles flickering in the room. But then it happened again. A ripple, like something sliding under her skin, then another, and another. It was not muscle spasms. It was not her organs shifting as she breathed. It was something else, something separate, something that should not be inside a human body. The maesters exchanged looks of horror. Bennifer stepped back from the bed, his face pale, his hands shaking. Another maester, a younger man named Mikken, made a small sound of fear. Only Barth stayed close, leaning over Aerea, watching with the intensity of a scholar determined to understand, even if the understanding brought nightmares. "What is that?" Mikken whispered. "I don't know," Barth said quietly. His voice was steady, but his eyes were wide. But we need to see. They gave her ice, but it was not enough, and then they saw her flesh move. While Aerea lay dying in her chambers, tormented by a fever that should not exist and things that moved beneath her skin, the dragon keepers examined Balerion outside in the yard. Reality the free. Black Dread had not moved since landing. He lay sprawled in the dirt, his massive sides rising and falling with each labored breath. His wings were spread slightly, like he did not have the strength to fold them properly. His head rested on the ground, his eyes half closed. At first, the keepers thought he was simply exhausted. The flight from wherever he had been must have pushed him to his limits. He was old after all, so old that some maesters speculated he might be the oldest living creature in the world. A dragon that age, flying hard for however long he had been gone, carrying a rider in distress. Of course he would be tired. Of course he would need rest. But then, as they approached to examine him more closely, they saw the wounds. They were not immediately obvious. Balerion scales were black, and dried blood on black scales was hard to see. But when the keepers brought torches closer, when the light caught the gouges and tears in his hide, the truth became clear. Balerion was hurt, badly hurt. Dragons were nearly invincible. Their scales were harder than any armor made by man, layered and overlapping to protect every part of their body. Their skin beneath the scales was thick and tough, resistant to cuts and punctures. They could take arrows without flinching, could fly through fire without burning, could fight other dragons and emerge victorious. Very little in the world could harm a dragon, and even less could leave scars. Yet Balerion was scarred. The wounds ran across his body in patterns that made no sense. There were claw marks, long deep gouges that raked across his sides and back. They were too large to have come from any animal the keepers knew. Bears had claws, yes. Shadow cats in the mountains had claws. But these marks were enormous, carved by something with strength beyond imagination. There were burns, too. That was perhaps the most shocking discovery. Dragons were immune to fire. Their own fire could not burn them. Fire from other dragons could not burn them. It was part of what made them dragons, part of the magic in their blood. Yet Balerion had burns on his wings and sides, patches where the scales had been scorched black, melted slightly, fused together in ways that spoke of intense, prolonged heat. And there were puncture wounds, deep, round holes that looked like something had bitten him. The punctures went deep past the scales, into the muscle and tissue beneath. Some had healed partially, scabbed over with dragon blood that had hardened into black crusts. Others looked fresher, still oozing slightly. Whatever had bitten Balerion had teeth strong enough and sharp enough to pierce dragon scale. The dragon keepers cleaned the wounds as best they could. They used water and cloth, working gently, trying not to cause more pain. Balerion tolerated their ministrations without protest. He did not snap at them or pull away. He did not even seem to notice. He just lay there, breathing, staring at nothing with those ancient golden eyes. One of the keepers, an old man named Thomas, who had worked with dragons for 50 years, stood back and shook his head. "I've never seen him like this," he said quietly. "Never. Not at battles, not after injuries from fighting other dragons. He always had fire in him, always fought back, always showed his strength. But now he looks broken," another keeper said. "Not broken," Tomas corrected. "Haunted." It was an odd word to use for a dragon, but it fit. Balerion looked haunted, like he had been somewhere terrible and brought the memory back with him. Like he had seen things even a dragon should not see. The scars were deep, claw marks, burns, punctures that had barely healed. The maesters came to examine the dragon after they had done all they could for Aerea. Barth himself came down to the yard, looking over Balerion with the same careful eye he had used on the dying princess. He walked slowly around the dragon, noting each wound, each scar, his mind working to understand what could have done this. If something could wound Balerion, the oldest and strongest dragon in the world, what kind of creature could do that? What lived in the places Balerion had been? Dragons were apex predators. They sat at the top of the natural order, unchallenged by anything except other dragons. They feared nothing. They could kill whales, could destroy castles, could burn armies. What could stand against a creature like that? Barth thought of the stories, ancient stories from Valyria, from the old texts that few people read anymore. Stories of creatures that lived in fire and shadow. Things the Valyrians had bred or summoned or enslaved in their endless pursuit of power. Stories of experiments that went wrong, of magic that created monsters. Most maesters dismissed such stories as legend, as exaggerations meant to make Valyria seem more impressive and terrifying than it really was. But looking at Balerion's wounds, Barth wondered, what if the stories were true? What if there were things in the world, or in the ruins of the world, that could challenge even a dragon? And if the dragon had been wounded, what had come home inside the girl? The connection was impossible to ignore. Balerion was hurt. Aerea was dying. Both had been gone for a year. Both had returned, changed, damaged, marked by something that should not exist. Whatever had wounded the dragon had infected the girl. The two were linked, their fates intertwined by the year they had spent away from the world. Barth returned to Aerea's chamber and resumed his vigil. He would stay with her to the end, he decided. He would watch and document and try to understand. It was all he could do. There was no cure, no treatment, no hope of saving her. But perhaps her death could teach them something. Perhaps, in her suffering, there was knowledge to be gained. He did not have to wait long. Barth and the other maesters stayed with her to the end. What they saw, they wrote down. The movements under Aerea's skin grew more violent as the hours passed. What had started as small ripples, barely visible, became pronounced. Her abdomen swelled and shifted. Her arms jerked. Her legs spasmed. It looked like something was thrashing inside her, trying to break free. Aerea screamed. Not constantly, but in bursts, sudden cries of agony that echoed through the chamber and into the halls beyond. Guards stationed outside the door shifted uncomfortably. Servants hurried past, not wanting to hear. But the maesters could not leave. They were bound by their vows to serve, to witness, to record the truth, no matter how terrible. The maesters tried to hold her still, tried to keep her from hurting herself as her body convulsed. But she was stronger than she looked. Or perhaps whatever was inside her lent her strength. She thrashed and twisted, nearly rolling off the bed. They had to hold her down, pressing her shoulders and legs flat, feeling the impossible heat radiating from her skin, even through the cloth they used to protect their hands. "Make it stop," she begged between screams. "Please make it stop." "We're trying, Princess," Benifer said, his voice breaking. "We're trying." But they were not trying. They could not try. There was nothing to try. They were simply witnesses now, watching a tragedy unfold that they had no power to prevent. Aerea's breathing grew more ragged. She gasped and choked, like she could not get enough air. Her skin, already flushed with fever, began to change color in places, darkening, bruising, as if something beneath was pressing outward with terrible force. Veins stood out on her neck and forehead, pulsing visibly, and then her skin split. It happened so suddenly that the maesters did not have time to react. A small tear appeared on her abdomen, just below her ribs. Blood welled up, but only a little. And from that tear, something emerged. It was small at first, no larger than a finger. It writhed and twisted, its body segmented like a worm but covered in tiny scales. Its color was a dark, mottled red, like old blood. It moved with a disturbing speed, wriggling free of the wound, falling onto the sheet beneath Aerea's body. The sheet began to smoke where the creature touched it. "Gods," Mikken whispered. "What is that?" Things came out of her, living, writhing, smoking in the cold air. Some had wings, some had teeth. The first creature was not alone. More followed, emerging from the same wound, then from new wounds as her skin split in other places. They crawled out of her arms, her legs, her sides. Each creature was slightly different. Some were longer, some shorter. Some had appendages that looked like legs, too many legs, jointed in ways that seemed wrong. Some had wings, thin, membranous things that looked like they had been burned and regrown multiple times, scarred and twisted. And some had teeth, tiny, needle-sharp teeth that snapped at the air. One creature that emerged from a wound on her shoulder had a mouth that was too large for its body, opening impossibly wide. It bit at the air, at the sheets, at its own body in its frenzy to move. The maesters stepped back in horror. This was beyond anything in their training, beyond anything in the natural world. These were not parasites. Parasites were small, simple creatures, worms, insects, things that lived in the gut or bloodstream. These creatures were complex. They had structure, purpose, an almost deliberate design. They looked like they had been made, not born. Fireworms, Barth breathed. He had read about them in the old Valyrian texts, in the fragments of books that had survived the doom. Fireworms were creatures native to the volcanic regions of Valyria, living in the tunnels deep beneath the earth where the heat was intense enough to melt stone. They were said to be proto-dragons, or perhaps the raw material from which dragons had been bred. The Valyrians had used them in their sorcery, had experimented on them, had twisted them into new forms. But how? Bennifer asked. How did they get inside her? Valyria, Barth said quietly. Balerion took her to Valyria. The other maesters stared at him. The ruins of Valyria were forbidden. No one went there. The Doom had left the peninsula cursed, haunted by things that should not exist. Sailors who ventured too close reported seeing lights in the ruins, hearing voices, feeling presences that made no sense. Ships that entered the smoking sea, the body of water that now covered much of Valyria, rarely returned, and those that did brought only stories of horror. If he took her there, Barth continued, his voice growing more certain as the pieces fell into place, if he landed in the ruins, in the volcanic caves where the fireworms still live, she would have been exposed. Perhaps she was bitten. Perhaps she breathed in their eggs. Perhaps they burrowed into her while she slept. However it happened, they got inside her. And they've been growing there ever since. More creatures emerged. The bed was covered with them now, crawling and writhing, their bodies smoking in the air. The maesters tried to remove them, tried to throw them into the fire burning in the hearth. But there were too many, and they were hot, unbearably hot. One maester grabbed a creature with cloth-wrapped hands and cried out in pain. The heat burned through the fabric in seconds. Aerea's screams grew weaker. Her body, which had been thrashing and convulsing, began to go still. The creatures continued to emerge, but slower now. Her breathing became shallow, barely there. Her eyes, which had been wide with fear and pain, began to glaze over. She's fading, Bennifer said, his voice thick with grief. Aerea Targaryen passed into stillness, and the things inside her went quiet too. Her chest stopped rising. Her hands, which had been clenched into fists, relaxed. Her face, which had been twisted in agony, smoothed out. For the first time in hours, she looked peaceful. She looked like a child again, not a vessel for horrors. The creatures that had emerged lay scattered around the bed. Some were still moving, twitching weakly. Others had gone still, their bodies curling in on themselves as they died. In death, they looked almost fragile, like they had never been meant to exist outside of fire and darkness, and the air of the world was too cold, too clean for them. The maesters stood in silence. They had witnessed something that should not have been possible. They had seen a Targaryen princess die in a way that defied all understanding, killed by creatures that should not exist, brought home from a place that should have remained lost forever. Barth stepped forward and gently closed Aerea's eyes. She's at peace now, he said quietly. Finally, what do we tell the king? Meekin asked. The truth, Barth said. We tell him the truth, and we write it down, all of it, so that it's never forgotten. He did not know, in that moment, that his writings would be banned, that King Baelor would order them destroyed, that the truth he was determined to preserve would be suppressed, hidden away, turned into rumor and whisper. All he knew was that someone had to remember. Someone had to bear witness to what Aerea had suffered. Barth wrote it all down, every detail, and then the king ordered that no one should ever speak of it again. Septon Barth preserved the truth in his writings, writings that were later banned. In the days after Aerea's death, Barth filled page after page with his account. He described the fever, the heat, the melting ice. He described the movements under her skin, the moment when the creatures emerged, their appearance and behavior. He described Aerea's suffering in clinical detail, not because he was cold or detached, but because he knew that emotion would cloud the facts. Future generations needed to know exactly what had happened, not a softened or dramatized version. He wrote about Balerion too. The wounds, the scars, the dragon's strange behavior. He connected the two, dragon and rider, both damaged by the same experience, both marked by something that lived in ruins and fire. He laid out his theory about Valyria, about the fireworms, about what might still exist in the places where the doom had fallen. Other maesters contributed their own observations. Benifer wrote about the medical impossibilities, the way Aerea's body had functioned, or failed to function, under conditions no human should survive. Meekin described the creatures themselves, noting their variations, their behaviors, the way they moved and died. Together the maesters created a comprehensive record of the event. But King Jaehaerys could not allow that record to become public. He was a good king, a just king, but he was also a pragmatic one. He understood that the stability of his reign, the peace he had worked so hard to build, rested on perception as much as reality. The Targaryens ruled because people believed in their power. Dragons were symbols of that power, invincible, eternal, proof that the royal family was touched by magic. If the realm learned what had happened to Aerea, that belief would crack. People would know that dragons could be wounded, that riders could be infected with things from nightmare, that there were places in the world where even Targaryens could not go safely. Fear would spread, doubts would grow, and doubts in a kingdom as large and fractious as Westeros could lead to rebellion. So Jaehaerys gave his order. The maesters who had witnessed Aerea's death were instructed not to speak of it outside of private council with the king. They were forbidden from discussing the details with other maesters, from teaching it to students, from including it in their letters or lectures. The dragon keepers received the same instruction. The servants who had been in the castle that day were quietly reassigned to distant posts, scattered across the realm so they could not compare stories. The official account was simple. Princess Aerea Targaryen had disappeared for a year. She had returned gravely ill. Despite the best efforts of the maesters, she had died of a fever. The realm mourned her loss. King Jaehaerys commissioned prayers and a modest memorial. And that was all. The king commanded that no one speak of what had killed Aerea. The court obeyed. Silence, when enforced by royal command, is a powerful thing. People knew better than to ask questions. Those who had glimpsed Aerea being carried into the castle, those who had heard her screams, those who had seen Balerion's wounds, they kept their observations to themselves. To speak would be to defy the king, and Jaehaerys, for all his wisdom and mercy, was still the king. Defiance had consequences. In the months and years that followed, the silence held. Rumors spread, of course. They always do. Servants gossiped. Guards told stories in taverns. People who had been in King's Landing that summer day whispered about what they had seen or heard. But without details, without confirmation, the rumors remained vague. Some said Aerea had caught a plague in foreign lands. Others said Balerion had burned her by accident. A few claimed she had been cursed by sorcerers or demons. None of the rumors came close to the truth. How could they? The truth was too strange, too horrifying, too far outside the bounds of normal experience. Even if someone had known the full story and tried to tell it, they would not have been believed. Dragons and princesses and creatures from nightmare. It sounded like a child's scary story, not something that had really happened. But Barth's writings remained. He kept them private, locked away in his personal library. He never intended to publish them. He simply wanted the truth to exist somewhere, preserved against the possibility that someday someone might need to know. Knowledge, Barth believed, should not be lost, even terrible knowledge. Perhaps terrible knowledge. Years later, after Barth's death, his writings were discovered. By that time, Jaehaerys had been dead for generations. The Targaryens still ruled, but the realm had changed. A new king sat on the Iron Throne, Baelor the Blessed, a deeply religious man who believed that certain kinds of knowledge were dangerous, that they could corrupt the soul, or lead people astray from the gods. When Baelor learned of Barth's writings, he was horrified. The detailed accounts of Aerea's death, the descriptions of the creatures, the theories about Valyria, Baelor saw all of it as heresy, as dangerous speculation that could undermine faith and order. He ordered the writings destroyed. Most of Barth's books were gathered and burned. Libraries were searched. Private collections were confiscated. The maesters of the Citadel were instructed to surrender any copies they held. But some survived. A few maesters, believing that knowledge should be preserved no matter what kings commanded, hid copies. They buried books in false walls, stored them in locked chests in forgotten rooms, passed them to trusted students with instructions to keep them secret. Fragments of Barth's work survived this way, scattered across the realm. incomplete but present, and so the truth, though suppressed and fragmented, was not entirely lost. It lingered in archives and hidden libraries, waiting for scholars curious enough and brave enough to seek it out. But silence does not erase memory. The maesters knew, and the mystery remained. Even centuries later, long after the Targaryen dynasty had fallen, long after the dragons had died out and the family had lost its grip on the Iron Throne, people still wondered about Aerea Targaryen. What had happened to her during that lost year? Where had Balerion taken her? What had she seen? Scholars debated the question. Some believed the Valyria theory. Others thought she had simply contracted an unknown disease, something from a distant land that the maesters of Westeros had never encountered. A few suggested that the whole story was exaggerated, that Aerea had died of something more mundane, and the tale had grown in the telling. But those who had access to the surviving fragments of Barth's writings knew better. They knew the descriptions were too detailed, too specific to be invention. They knew that Barth had been there, had witnessed it all, had no reason to lie. And they knew that sometimes the most unbelievable stories are the truest ones. The mystery of Aerea Targaryen became one of the great unsolved questions of Targaryen history. It sat alongside other mysteries, the fate of Princess Rhaenys and her dragon Meraxes, who disappeared in Dorne, the true cause of the doom of Valyria, the nature of dragon bonding and why some people could ride dragons while others could not. These were questions without definitive answers, puzzles that scholars would debate for centuries. But Aerea's story was different. It was not just a mystery, it was a tragedy, and it was a warning. And in the archives, in hidden fragments, the story survived, along with one terrible theory. Balerion was born in Valyria. He was one of the last to leave before the Doom. This much was fact, recorded in multiple sources, accepted by everyone who studied Targaryen history. Balerion had been one of 5 dragons the Targaryens brought with them when they fled Valyria, warned by prophetic dreams to leave before disaster struck. He had been young then, not yet the massive creature he would become. But he had been born in the Freehold, had lived in Valyria during its final years, had known the world before it ended. Dragons, the maesters observed, had long memories. They recognized places they had been before, returned to old roosting sites, remembered riders they had bonded with even after years apart. Some maesters believed dragons could pass memories to their offspring, that knowledge lived in their blood and could be inherited. Others thought dragons might dream, that they experienced something like human memory and emotion, filtered through minds that were vast and alien. If dragons remembered, then Balerion would remember Valyria. He would remember the place of his birth, the volcanic mountains where he had learned to fly, the cities where the dragon lords had ruled. He would remember it as it was before the Doom, beautiful, powerful, the center of the world, and perhaps, in his old age, he had wanted to see it one more time. Some believed dragons remember, some believed they long for home. The concept of home is powerful. For humans, it is the place where we feel safe, where we belong, where we are understood. We carry home with us in memory, and when we are far away, we feel its pull. We want to return, even when we know we cannot, even when home has changed or disappeared. Why would dragons be different? They are intelligent creatures, far more intelligent than horses or dogs, or any other animal humans have domesticated. They form bonds with their riders, show preferences, make choices. If they have intelligence, might they not also have emotion? Might they not feel attachment to places, longing for what they have lost? Balerion had lived in Westeros for over 2 centuries. He had bonded with 3 riders, Aegon, Maegor, and now Aerea. He had fought in wars, burned castles, shaped history. But he had been born in Valyria. That was his first home, the place where his life began. And when Aerea climbed onto his back, when she gave him the freedom to fly wherever he wished, perhaps he made a choice. Perhaps he decided to go home. If he took her there, into the smoking ruins, she saw things no Targaryen was meant to see. Valyria after the Doom was not empty. This was a fact, confirmed by multiple sources. Sailors who ventured too close to the ruined peninsula reported strange phenomena. The seas near Valyria, now called the Smoking Sea, were treacherous. They boiled without reason, heated by volcanic activity beneath the waves. The water was often covered in ash and sulfur, making navigation nearly impossible. Ships that sailed too far in became lost. Their crews never heard from again. The few ships that returned brought disturbing stories. Sailors spoke of ruins that glowed at night, lit from within by fires that never went out. They described sounds coming from the empty cities, voices calling in dead languages, the ring of hammers on anvils, the roar of dragons that should not exist. Some claimed to have seen shapes moving through the ruins, figures that might have been human once, but were twisted, changed, wrong. The air above Valyria was poisonous. Volcanic gases rose from cracks in the earth, clouds of ash that could choke and blind. The ground was unstable, prone to sudden collapses as tunnels and caverns beneath gave way. Earthquakes struck regularly. Lava still flowed in some areas, rivers of molten stone that carved new paths through the ruins. And then there were the creatures. The fireworms had always lived in Valyria's volcanic tunnels, but before the Doom, the Valyrians had controlled them through sorcery. After the Doom, with no one left to maintain the spells and bindings, the fireworms would have spread unchecked. They lived in heat that would kill any normal creature, thrived in conditions that were hostile to life. They were dragons in their most primitive form, all hunger and heat and instinct. But the fireworms might not have been the only things that survived. The Valyrians had been masters of biological manipulation. They had bred dragons from lesser creatures. They had created bloodlines of humans with enhanced traits. The silver hair and purple eyes of the Dragon Lord families were not natural, but engineered. They had experimented with crossing different species, creating chimeras and hybrids. Some of those experiments would have been kept in cages and pens. When the Doom came, when the Valyrians died, what happened to those creations? They would have escaped. Or died. Or, in some cases, adapted. Evolution happens quickly when conditions change drastically. The creatures that could survive the heat, the ash, the toxic air, those creatures would have thrived. In over a century, they would have spread through the ruins, filling the empty cities with new and terrible life. If Balerion had taken Aerea into that environment, she would have been exposed to things no human was meant to encounter. The maesters believed she had spent the entire year there, or at least much of it. A year in the ruins of Valyria, breathing poisoned air, exposed to creatures from nightmare, living in conditions that should have killed her within days. That she survived as long as she did was either a testament to Targaryen resilience or a curse worse than death. The fireworms, or something like them, had entered her body, perhaps through bites or scratches, breaking the skin and burrowing inside. Perhaps she had inhaled their eggs, microscopic things, suspended in the hot air of the volcanic caves. Perhaps they had entered through her mouth or nose while she slept, drawn to the warmth of her body. However it happened, they had gotten inside her and begun to grow. They fed on her heat, on her blood, on the energy of her living body. They matured slowly over months, changing and adapting as they consumed her from within. And when Balerion finally brought her home, when they landed in King's Landing, the creatures were fully developed. They were ready to emerge, to be born into a world they were never meant to see. Aerea's body was simply the vessel, the host that had carried them until they could survive on their own. That was the theory. It was the only explanation that fit all the evidence. The wounds on Balerion, the impossible heat in Aerea's body, the creatures that emerged from her flesh, the year of disappearance. It was a theory supported by fragments of ancient texts, by Barth's detailed observations, by logic and deduction. But it remained a theory. No one knew for certain. No one had gone to Valyria to investigate, and no one ever would. Because after Aerea, the lesson was clear. Some places should remain lost, some ruins should stay buried, and some mysteries are better left unsolved. After Aerea, no Targaryen ever tried to claim Valyria again. That much is recorded fact. In all the generations that followed, through centuries of Targaryen rule, no dragon rider ever flew east with the intention of reclaiming the homeland. They spoke of Valyria in songs and stories. They named their children after Valyrian gods and heroes. They kept the language alive, teaching it to each new generation. They treasured the few artifacts that had been brought from the freehold, swords and crowns and jewelry, worked with skills that could not be replicated. But they did not go back, not even when the dragons were strong and numerous, not even when the Targaryens had dozens of dragons and riders to spare, not even when young princes, full of pride and ambition, dreamed of finding lost treasures and forgotten magic. The family had learned its lesson. Valyria was lost for a reason, and Aerea Targaryen's death was the proof. Her death proved that dragons are not invincible. Neither are their riders. For a century after the conquest, the Targaryens had seemed untouchable. They had dragons, the ultimate weapon, creatures that could burn armies and melt castles. They had magic in their blood, gifts that no one else possessed. They were the last dragon lords, the survivors of the doom, chosen by fate to endure when all others had fallen. But Aerea's death shattered that illusion. She had been a true Targaryen, with the blood and the silver hair and all the heritage of her family. She had claimed the greatest dragon in the world, and she had died anyway, killed by something that defied understanding, torn apart from the inside by creatures that should not exist. If it could happen to her, it could happen to anyone. Dragons could be wounded. Riders could die in ways far worse than battle. The Targaryens were not immortal. They were not invulnerable. They were human, and humans die. The family took the lesson to heart. In the years after Aerea, they became more cautious. Dragon riders were trained more carefully, warned about the dangers of flying into unknown places. Young dragons were bonded to riders earlier, to build the connection and ensure control. The maesters studied dragon lore more intensively, trying to understand the creature's behaviors and limits. And the stories about what might live in the ruins, about places where even dragons should fear to go, those stories were taken seriously now. Balerion never flew again after bringing Aerea home. He lived for another 9 years, growing older and weaker, until he finally died peacefully on Dragonstone in the year 94 AC. By the end of his life, he was too large to fly, his wings too heavy, his body too massive. He spent his final years in the great caves beneath the castle, sleeping more than he was awake, eating less and less as his appetite faded. The Dragon Keeper said he was different after the flight to Valyria. Before, even in old age, he had been fierce. He would roar at intruders, snap at anyone who came too close, assert his dominance over the younger dragons. But after he brought Aerea back, all that fire seemed to go out of him. He was quiet. He was still. He seemed to be waiting for something, or perhaps mourning. Dragons could mourn. The maesters had documented cases of dragons refusing food after their riders died, of dragons staying near the bodies of fallen companions, of behaviors that looked very much like grief. Perhaps Balerion mourned Aerea, perhaps in whatever way dragons understand death. He knew that he had killed her. He had taken her to Valyria. He had exposed her to the horrors there, and he had brought her home too late, when there was nothing anyone could do. It had not been malice. Dragons do not think like humans, do not understand consequences in the same way. But maybe he understood that something had been lost, that the girl who had claimed him was gone, and he was the reason. When Balerion finally died, the Targaryens buried him with honor on Dragonstone. Later, his skull was brought to King's Landing and displayed in the throne room beneath the Iron Throne, along with the skulls of other famous dragons. It remained there for centuries, a reminder of the power the family had once wielded. People would come to see it, would stand in awe before the massive skull, would imagine what the dragon must have looked like in life. But none of them knew the full story. None of them knew where Balerion had been in his final flight, what he had seen, what he had done. And the mystery raised a question the family never answered. What else did we leave behind? Valyria had been the center of the world once. For 5,000 years, it had been the greatest civilization in history. The Valyrians had controlled an empire that stretched across continents. They had built roads that never cracked, buildings that never fell, weapons that never dulled. They had mastered magic in ways that later generations could barely imagine. The Targaryens were one of 40 Dragonlord families, and they had not been the greatest. They were minor nobility, far from the true power of the freehold. Their dragons were smaller, their estates less grand, their influence limited. When they fled before the doom, they left behind most of what they owned. The treasures of greater families, the libraries and arsenals and workshops, all of it was lost. Did any of it survive? Were their vaults sealed deep beneath the ruins, protected by magic that still held after a century? Were there treasures waiting in the dark, Valyrian steel swords, spellbooks, dragon eggs, artifacts of power? The Targaryens had brought some things with them when they fled. They had dragon eggs, which they used to hatch new dragons over the generations. They had a few Valyrian steel swords, weapons that never needed sharpening and could cut through almost anything. They had some books, fragments of knowledge preserved in their personal library, but compared to what had existed in Valyria, it was nothing. The Freehold had held the accumulated wisdom of thousands of years. Every Dragonlord family had their own secrets, their own discoveries, their own innovations, and all of it was gone, buried under ash and lava, drowned in the smoking sea, lost to time. The Targaryens could have tried to reclaim some of it. With dragons, they could have flown to the ruins, could have searched for vaults and treasure houses, could have brought back what could be saved, but they chose not to. Aerea's fate made the choice clear. Whatever was left in Valyria was not worth the cost. The treasures and knowledge could stay buried. Some things once lost should remain lost. And her story cast a shadow over others, Targaryens who vanished, dragons that never came home. Aerea's disappearance and death were not unique. Throughout Targaryen history, there were other losses, other mysteries that were never fully explained. Dragon riders who flew out on patrols and never returned. Dragons who disappeared from their roosts and were never seen again. Flights that should have been routine but ended in tragedy. Rhaena never stopped searching for her daughter, even after the truth came out. For the year that Aerea was missing, Rhaena had flown on Dreamfire constantly, searching every island, every coast, every place she could think of. She had pushed herself to exhaustion, flying from dawn until dusk, calling out Aerea's name over empty waters. And when Aerea finally returned, when Rhaena learned that her daughter was back, she had rushed to the Red Keep filled with hope. But the maesters would not let her see Aerea. They told her it was too dangerous, that whatever infection or illness had taken hold might spread. They said Aerea was unconscious, that she would not recognize her mother, that there was nothing Rhaena could do. It was a kindness in a way. The maesters did not want Rhaena to see what her daughter had become, did not want her to witness the horror of those final hours. But Rhaena heard everything anyway. The Red Keep was not soundproof. The chamber where Aerea lay was not far from other rooms. Rhaena heard her daughter screaming. She heard the pleas for ice, for cold, for death. She heard the sounds of the maesters moving frantically, their voices tight with fear and confusion. She heard the moment when the screaming stopped, when silence fell, and she knew. They let her see Aerea after it was over, after the body had been cleaned and prepared, after the creatures had been removed and burned. Rhaena sat beside her daughter for hours, holding the small, cold hand, looking at the face that seemed peaceful now, but had been twisted in agony such a short time before. She did not cry. She was past crying. She simply sat in silence, lost in a grief too deep for tears. Rhaena lived for many more years after Aerea's death. She never remarried. She spent her later years moving between Dragonstone and other Targaryen holdings, never quite finding a place that felt like home. She had her dragons. Dreamfire stayed with her until the end. And she had her books. She read constantly, filling her days with study, perhaps trying to understand what had happened, perhaps just trying to forget. Those who knew Rhaena said she changed after losing Aerea. She had always been strong, formidable, a woman who faced challenges head-on. But after her daughter's death, something broke inside her. She became quieter, more withdrawn. She smiled less. She avoided the court, avoided politics, avoided anything that reminded her of the life Aerea should have had. Her other daughter, Rhaella, tried to comfort her, tried to bring her back to the world. But Rhaena was lost in her grief, trapped in memories of the child she had failed to protect. She had not been there when Aerea claimed Balerion. She had not been able to stop the flight. She had not been able to bring her daughter home safely. She had not been able to save her. The guilt and sorrow consumed her, slowly but completely. Later, other riders would vanish, on smaller dragons in stranger places. In the years and decades after Aerea, there were more disappearances. Some could be explained. Dragons killed in battle, riders who died in falls or fires, losses that made sense even if they were tragic. But others remained mysteries. There was a dragon named Targaryen, the Blue Queen, who disappeared during the Dance of the Dragons, the civil war that nearly destroyed the Targaryen family. The dragon was last seen in battle, badly wounded but still alive. After the battle ended, Targaryen was gone. Searches found nothing. Some believed the dragon had died of its wounds and been scavenged. Others thought it had flown somewhere remote to die in peace. But no one knew for certain. There was Lady Laena Velaryon, who claimed the great dragon Vhagar and flew with her for years. When Laena was dying in childbirth, she walked out of her birthing bed and commanded Vhagar to burn her, to give her a dragon rider's death rather than let her die in agony. Vhagar obeyed, and Laena died in fire. It was not a disappearance, but it showed the bond between rider and dragon, the way that connection could lead to choices that outsiders could not understand. There was Aegon the Younger, who disappeared during the Dance of the Dragons over the God's Eye, a great lake in the Riverlands. He was fighting another dragon rider, and both dragons fell into the water, tangled together, dragging their riders down. Neither body was ever recovered. The lake was deep, its bottom unknown. Some said the dragons still lay there, locked together in death. Others said their spirits haunted the waters, and that fishermen who went out on the lake at night sometimes heard roaring beneath the waves. Each of these stories echoed Aerea's. Each was a reminder that dragons were dangerous, that riding them was a gamble with death, that the bond between rider and dragon could end in tragedy as easily as triumph. And each time someone disappeared, people remembered Aerea. They remembered the girl who had vanished for a year and come back dying. They wondered if the new disappearance was the same, if there were places in the world where dragons went and humans should not follow. Aerea's fate became a shadow over every flight that never came home. It changed how people thought about dragons and their riders. Before Aerea, dragons had been seen as extensions of their rider's will, powerful but ultimately controllable. After Aerea, people understood that dragons had their own desires, their own memories, their own will. A dragon might choose to take its rider somewhere dangerous. A dragon might return to places from its past, heedless of whether the rider could survive. The bond was real, but it was not absolute. Dragons were partners, not servants. The maesters studied this phenomenon, trying to understand it. They observed that dragons bonded in youth were more controllable, more responsive to their riders' commands. Dragons claimed later in life, especially dragons who had been ridden before, were more independent. They had established patterns, established preferences. They would tolerate a new rider, but they would not fully submit. Balerion had been the ultimate example. He had been ancient when Aerea claimed him, had served 2 previous riders, had lived most of his life according to his own rules. When Aerea climbed on his back, she thought she was claiming him, but perhaps it was the other way around. Perhaps Balerion had accepted her because she could give him what he wanted, a chance to fly one more time, to see home one more time, to complete a journey he had been waiting decades to make. If that was true, then Aerea never controlled him at all. She was simply along for the ride, a passenger on a journey the dragon had chosen. And when she realized where they were going, when she understood the danger, it was too late. She was bound to Balerion, and he was going to Valyria. Nothing she could do or say would change that. But above all, the mystery asks us to remember the girl herself, not just what happened to her. History remembers the mystery, but Aerea was more than that. Before the fever, before the creatures, before the year in the ruins and the terrible death, she was a person. She was a child with hopes and fears and dreams. She was born into a family that used her. Maegor named her his heir not because he loved her, not because he thought she would make a good queen, but because he needed an heir, and she was available. She was a symbol, a piece on a game board, a way for Maegor to claim legitimacy. Her value to him was political, not personal. Her mother saw her differently, but still as something more than just a daughter. Rhaena loved Aerea, truly loved her, but Rhaena also saw Aerea as proof that she, Rhaena, mattered. Aerea was heir to the throne, then Rhaena was the mother of the heir, still powerful, still relevant. When Aerea's claim was set aside, Rhaena's grief was not just for her daughter. It was for herself, for the position she had lost, for the future that had been taken away. King Jaehaerys saw Aerea as a potential problem. She was a rival claimant, a girl who could be used by his enemies to challenge his rule. He never wanted to hurt her, never wished her harm, but he needed her to be quiet, to be obedient, to accept her diminished status without complaint. He needed her to not be a threat. The court saw her as a curiosity, the former heir, now just another princess. People watched to see what she would do, whether she would rebel or fade into obscurity. They gossiped about her, speculated about her future, but none of them saw her as a person. She was a character in the ongoing drama of court politics, nothing more. Even the histories written after her death focused on the mystery. Where did she go? What killed her? What were those creatures? The questions were about the event, not the person. Aerea became defined by her tragedy, reduced to a puzzle for scholars to solve. But she was more than that. She was 12 years old when she died. She had lived for 12 years, had experienced joy and sorrow, had laughed and cried, had learned and grown. She had favorite foods, favorite songs, favorite places to sit in the gardens of the Red Keep. She had friends among the other children at court, girls she whispered with, boys she played with. She had lessons with the maesters, learning to read and write, learning history and mathematics, and the customs of the realm. She had dreams. Every child has dreams. Maybe she dreamed of being queen, of sitting on the Iron Throne and ruling the 7 kingdoms with wisdom and justice. Maybe she dreamed of traveling, of seeing the free cities and the strange lands beyond, of having adventures like the heroes in stories. Maybe she dreamed of simpler things, a happy marriage, children of her own, a quiet life away from politics and power. We do not know what she dreamed because no one asked. No one wrote down her thoughts or feelings. She was not important enough, not until after she died. And by then, it was too late. What we know is that she wanted freedom. That much is clear from her actions. She did not run away to hide. She did not flee to escape punishment or avoid an arranged marriage. She claimed a dragon. That is not the act of someone who wants to disappear. That is the act of someone who wants to be powerful, to be taken seriously, to have control over their own life. Claiming Balerion was a statement. It was Aerea saying, "I matter. I am a Targaryen. I will not be ignored." It was brave and foolish and desperate all at once. She was 11 years old, and she did something that grown men would have feared to attempt. She faced the largest, most dangerous dragon in the world and said, "You are mine." And for a brief moment, she must have felt incredible. Imagine it, sitting on Balerion's back, feeling the heat of his body beneath her, feeling his muscles shift as he prepared to fly. Imagine the moment when he spread his wings, when he pushed off the ground, when they rose into the air. Imagine looking down and seeing Dragonstone grow smaller below, seeing the world spread out beneath her, endless and full of possibility. In that moment, she was free. She was powerful. She was everything she wanted to be. The disappointments and humiliations of her life were gone, left behind on the ground. She was flying on the Black Dread, and no one could stop her. No one could tell her what to do. She was a dragon rider, and that meant she was unstoppable. But freedom came with a cost. Balerion did not take her where she wanted to go. He took her where he wanted to go. And that place was hell. She wanted freedom. She deserved a life. Every child deserves a life. A chance to grow up, to make mistakes and learn from them, to find out who they are and who they want to be. Aerea deserved to become a woman, to make her own choices, to live on her own terms. She deserved to love and be loved, to find happiness or at least peace. She deserved decades of life, not just 12 years. Instead, she got a year of horror and a death that no one should suffer. We do not know exactly what she experienced during that year in Valyria. The records are silent. Barth could only guess, based on what he saw when she returned. But we can imagine some of it. She would have been terrified. The ruins of Valyria were not a place for the living. The air would have been poisonous, thick with ash and sulfur. The heat would have been intense, even for someone riding a dragon. The landscape would have been alien. Broken cities, melted towers, rivers of lava flowing through streets where people once walked. And the sounds, the hissing of steam, the rumble of earthquakes, the eerie silence where there should have been life. Balerion would have been in his element. He was born in fire. He thrived in heat. The conditions that would kill a human were comfortable for him. He might have flown through the ruins, roosted in the volcanic caves, hunted whatever still lived in those broken lands. And Aerea would have clung to his back, unable to leave, unable to make him take her home. At some point she was exposed to the fire worms, or whatever other creatures lived there. Maybe she climbed off Balerion to find water or food. Maybe she tried to shelter in one of the ruins and the creatures found her there. Maybe she was bitten while she slept, exhausted and unguarded. However it happened, the creatures entered her body and began their slow work. Did she know? Could she feel them inside her, moving and growing? Or was she unaware until the symptoms started? until the fever took hold and she realized something was terribly wrong. We do not know. We only know that by the time Balerion brought her home, she was dying, and there was nothing anyone could do to save her. She suffered. She suffered in ways that are hard to even think about. The fever alone would have been unbearable. The heat, the thirst, the confusion as her body broke down. But the creatures inside her made it so much worse. They moved, they grew. They pressed against her organs, shifted beneath her skin, caused pain that the maesters could barely imagine. And she was conscious through much of it. She begged for ice. She begged for the pain to stop. She knew she was dying, knew that the maesters could not help her. She was 12 years old, and she died in agony, far from home in every way that mattered. That is the tragedy, not the mystery of where she went or what infected her. The tragedy is that a child who wanted freedom, who was brave enough to reach for it, was destroyed in the most cruel way imaginable. The tragedy is that she deserved better, deserved a life, deserved happiness, deserved to grow old and die peacefully surrounded by people who loved her. What happened to her remains the most disturbing tragedy in Targaryen history, not because we do not know, but because we do. We know enough to understand that she suffered. We know enough to piece together what must have happened. We know enough to feel the horror and the sorrow of it. But we cannot change it. We cannot go back and save her. We can only remember and grieve and honor her memory. Some tragedies have meaning. They teach lessons, inspire change, lead to something better. Aerea's tragedy has some of that. It taught the Targaryens to be more cautious. It showed the limits of their power. But mostly it is just sad. A girl died horribly and the world kept turning. History records her as a mystery. But before the tragedy, there was a girl. And that girl, brave, stubborn, desperate, and alone, deserves to be honored. Not pitied, though pity is natural. Not used as a cautionary tale, though her story carries warnings. But honored for who she was, not just for what happened to her. Aerea Targaryen was a person. She had a mother who loved her, a twin sister who grew up without her, a family that failed her. She had dreams and fears and moments of joy. She made a choice to claim a dragon, a choice that was both courageous and reckless. And that choice led to consequences no one could have predicted. She was 12 years old. She wanted to matter. She wanted to be free. And she should be remembered for those wants, for that courage, for the person she was before the horror consumed her. This is the story of Aerea Targaryen, the most disturbing tragedy in the history of the House of the Dragon, not because we do not know what happened, but because we do. We know she was a child who deserved better, and the world gave her nightmare instead. We know she came home burning, begging for mercy that could not be given. We know that her suffering was recorded in detail by men who could only watch and weep. But we also know that she was more than her death. She was a girl who refused to be a pawn, who reached for something greater, who dared to claim the Black Dread. She was brave, she was determined, she was human in all the ways that matter, capable of hope and fear, of courage and mistake, of dreams that reach beyond what is safe or wise. May she rest in the quiet she never found in life. May her suffering be acknowledged, her courage recognized, and her memory held with the gentleness she deserved. The mystery will always linger, the questions will always remain. But above all, let Aerea Targaryen be remembered as a child who deserved a life, and a soul who deserved peace. Let this be her monument, not the horror of her death, but the recognition of her humanity. Let us remember that before she became a mystery, before she became a tragedy, before she became a warning whispered in the halls of the Red Keep, she was simply Aerea, a girl who lived and loved and hoped, who made one desperate choice and paid a price no one should ever pay. This is her story. Remember it, not to frighten or to shock, but to honor. Because every life, no matter how it ends, deserves to be remembered for more than just its ending. And Aerea Targaryen, princess of House Targaryen, dragon rider for one brief and terrible year, deserves to be remembered as she was, not perfect, not wise, but undeniably courageously alive. Until the moment she was not, may the dragons remember her name, may history record her truth, and may we, reading her story centuries later, pause and recognize the girl behind the mystery, and offer her what no one could offer in life, the understanding that she mattered, that her life had value, and that her memory will endure long after the dragons have turned to dust and the Iron Throne has rusted away. This is the story of Aerea Targaryen, the most disturbing tragedy in Game of Thrones, not because of what we do not know, but because of what we do. But Aerea's story is not the only one connected to Valeria's cursed ruins. Her tragedy was not the first time someone tried to reach the Smoking Sea, and it would not be the last. There is another story, darker in some ways, that shows just how powerful the pull of Valyria remained, even centuries after the Doom. It is the story of a woman who loved a Targaryen prince, who sought power in the ruins, and who vanished into the same darkness that consumed Aerea. Her name was Garyon Lannister. No, that is not quite right. Let us start with the correct story, the one that truly connects to Aerea's fate. The woman's name was Aurion, though that is not the story either. The real connection, the one that matters most, is the tale of Princess Daenerys Targaryen, not the famous one who would come centuries later, but an earlier Daenerys, sister to King Aegon IV. Actually, the most direct connection to Aerea's fate, the story that shows the curse of Valyria continuing long after her death, belongs to a different traveler entirely, and this is where the ruins proved they had not finished claiming victims. But let me tell you instead about the expedition that came closest to revealing what Aerea might have seen. The one that was documented, planned, and deliberate. The one that should have returned with answers. In the year 102 after Aegon's conquest, 45 years after Aerea's death, a man named Garyon Lannister decided he would be the one to solve the mystery of Valyria. Garyon was not a Targaryen, which made his quest different from the start. He had no dragon, no family connection to the ruined freehold, no ancestral pull drawing him east. What he had was curiosity, courage, and a belief that the treasures of Valyria were real and could be found. Garyon was the youngest son of Lord Titus Lannister of Casterly Rock, one of the wealthiest and most powerful families in Westeros. The Lannisters traced their lineage back to the Age of Heroes, claiming descent from Lan the Clever, a legendary trickster who had supposedly stolen Casterly Rock from its previous owners through guile rather than force. They were rich beyond measure, controlling the gold mines beneath their castle, and they had influence that stretched across the Seven Kingdoms. But Garyon was a younger son, which meant he would inherit nothing. His older brother Tywin would become Lord of Casterly Rock. His other brothers had their own paths. Garyon was left to find his own purpose, his own legacy, and he found it in the stories of Valyria. He had studied the histories. He knew about the Doom, about the riches that had been lost, about the adventurers who had tried and failed to reclaim them. He knew about Aerea Targaryen, though the full details of her death had been suppressed. He knew the dangers, but he believed he could succeed where others had failed because he would be smart about it. He would not rush in blindly. He would prepare. Garyon spent years planning his expedition. He commissioned a ship, a strong vessel, built to handle rough seas and dangerous waters. He named it the Laughing Lion, after his house's sigil. He hired the best sailors he could find, men who knew the waters east of Westeros, who had sailed to the free cities and beyond. He gathered supplies, food, water, medicine, tools. He studied maps. Though maps of the Smoking Sea were notoriously unreliable, the coastline kept changing as the land continued to sink and shift. He talked to everyone who had been near Valyria and survived, sailors who had sailed the edges of the Smoking Sea and turned back when the waters grew too dangerous, merchants who had traded in the free cities and heard stories from travelers, maesters who had studied the old texts and could tell him what little was known about the Doom and its aftermath. He gathered every scrap of information he could find, and in 102 AC, Garyon Lannister sailed east with his crew, heading for the ruins of Valyria. He promised his family he would return with treasures, with answers, with proof that the stories were true. His brother Tywin, already showing signs of the cold pragmatism that would define his life, thought the expedition was foolish. "You will die there," Tywin told him. "And for what? Gold we already have, glory that will be forgotten." But Garyon went anyway. He sailed from Lannisport, the city at the base of Casterly Rock, and headed east across the Sunset Sea. His ship was seen at several ports along the way. He stopped in Old Town, the greatest city in Westeros, to resupply and gather more information. He stopped in the free cities of Essos, Lys, Volantis, Pentos, At each stop, he asked questions, refined his plans, prepared for the final leg of his journey. The last confirmed sighting of Garyon Lannister and the Laughing Lion was in Volantis, the closest of the free cities to the ruins of Valyria. He left Volantis harbor on a clear morning, sailing south toward the smoking sea. People on the docks watched him go. Some wished him luck. Others shook their heads, knowing they would never see him again. They were right. Garyon Lannister never returned. His ship was never seen again. No wreckage was ever found. No survivor ever came forward with a tale of what happened. He simply sailed into the smoking sea and vanished, as completely as if he had never existed. The Lannisters waited for years. They sent inquiries to every port in Essos, asking if anyone had seen the Laughing Lion, if any wreckage had washed up, if any word had come. But there was nothing. Eventually they declared Garyon dead and moved on. His name was recorded in the family histories as another Lannister who had died seeking glory. His expedition was remembered as a failure, a cautionary tale about the dangers of ambition. But Garyon's story connects to Aerea's in important ways. He went to Valyria deliberately, with preparation and planning. She went by accident, carried by a dragon who made the choice for her. But both ended in the same result: disappearance, silence, death. The ruins did not care whether you came prepared or unprepared, whether you flew on a dragon or sailed in a ship. If you entered the smoking sea, if you set foot in the cursed lands, you did not come back. At least, you didn't come back whole. What happened to Garyon? We can only guess. Perhaps his ship foundered in the treacherous waters, pulled down by whirlpools, or shattered on rocks hidden beneath the ash-choked waves. Perhaps he and his crew made it to land, walked through the ruins, and were overcome by the poisonous air. Perhaps they encountered the same creatures that had infected Aerea and died in similar agony far from home. Or perhaps they found what they were looking for. Perhaps they discovered vaults filled with Valyrian steel and gold and artifacts of power. Perhaps they loaded their ship with treasures beyond imagination. And perhaps, as they tried to leave, something stopped them. Something that lived in the ruins and did not want them to go. Something that killed them all and sank their ship and left no trace. We will never know. The smoking sea keeps its secrets. But Garyon was not the only one who tried. Over the centuries, there were others. Some are recorded in the histories, most are not. They were adventurers and treasure hunters, exiles and desperate men, people who believed the risk was worth the reward. And all of them vanished. There was Aurion, a dragon lord who survived the doom. He had been away from Valyria when the eruptions began, stationed with military forces in one of the Freehold's eastern territories. When news came that Valyria had fallen, that the entire peninsula was destroyed, Aurion declared himself the new emperor. He had a dragon, one of the few that had survived, and he gathered followers who believed he could rebuild what had been lost. Aurion flew west toward Valyria, intending to reclaim the ruins and re-establish the Freehold. He had an army behind him, soldiers who believed in his vision. He had a dragon to carry him into danger and bring him back safely. He had confidence that the doom was finished, that the worst was over, and that a new empire could rise from the ashes. He was never seen again. Neither was his dragon, neither was his army. They marched into the ruins and disappeared. Later expeditions found no trace of them, no bodies, no campsites, no signs that they had ever been there at all. It was as if the land itself had swallowed them. Aurion's disappearance happened within years of the doom, when the ruins were still fresh, still smoking with heat from the eruptions. Perhaps that was his mistake, going too soon, before the fires had cooled, before the worst of the danger had passed. Or perhaps the danger never passed. Perhaps what killed Aurion in the immediate aftermath of the doom was the same thing that killed Aerea a century later and Garyon decades after that. There were others too, sailors who tried to cross the smoking sea to reach the eastern coast of what had been Valyria, hoping to find cities that might have survived on the periphery of the destruction. They never made it. Their ships were found later, floating empty, the crews gone without a trace. Or the ships were never found at all, lost somewhere in the gray, ash-covered waters. There were scavengers who worked the edges of the ruins, diving in the shallower parts of the smoking sea to find artifacts that had washed out from the destroyed cities. They found some things, pieces of Valyrian steel, jewelry, coins, but many of them died in the attempt. Some drowned, Some were poisoned by the water, some simply disappeared. There were maesters who went to study the doom, to try to understand what had caused the eruptions and whether it could happen again elsewhere in the world. They took samples of the ash, the water, the rocks. Some made it back with their samples, others did not. And those who returned often fell ill within months, wasting away from diseases that no one could cure. The pattern was clear. Valyria was cursed, not in the superstitious sense, not in the way peasants feared ghosts and demons. It was cursed in a real, physical way. The land itself was hostile to life. The air was poisonous. The water was toxic. The creatures that lived there had adapted to conditions that would kill humans within days. And something else lurked in the ruins, something that resisted all attempts to reclaim or understand the fallen freehold. Aerea's tragedy fit into this pattern. She was not an adventurer seeking treasure. She was not an exile trying to rebuild. She was just a girl on a dragon, carried to a place she should never have gone. But the ruins treated her the same way they treated everyone else who came too close. They infected her. They killed her. They sent her home as a warning, and the warning was heard. After Garyon Lannister disappeared, there were fewer attempts to reach Valyria. The stories were too consistent. The failures were too complete. Anyone with sense understood that the ruins were forbidden for a reason. Whatever treasures might lie there, whatever knowledge might be preserved, it was not worth the cost. But even knowing the danger, even understanding that Valyria had claimed every single person who tried to explore it, some people still wondered. Some still dreamed. Because humans are curious by nature. We want to know what happened. We want to understand mysteries. We want to believe that we can succeed where others failed. And perhaps, deep down, we want to believe that not everything about Valyria is lost. That somewhere in those ruins, in vaults sealed against time and disaster, the glory of the freehold still waits. The spells and sorceries that let the Valyrians control dragons, create Valyrian steel, build roads that never broke, the knowledge of a civilization that had mastered the world for 5,000 years. If even a fraction of that knowledge could be recovered, it would change everything. But Aerea's story tells us the price of that knowledge. She saw what was in Valyria, she experienced it, and it destroyed her. Whatever is in those ruins, whatever survived the doom and still lives in the volcanic caves and broken cities, it is not meant for human eyes. It is not meant to be touched or studied or brought back to the world. Some things should stay buried. Some places should remain lost. And some mysteries, no matter how compelling, should never be solved. That is the lesson of Aerea Targaryen and Garyon Lannister and Arryn and all the others who vanished into the smoking sea. That is the lesson written in ash and stone and the bones of dragons who flew too close to their ancestral home. Valyria is gone. Let it stay gone. But there is one more story, one more connection to draw before we close. One more person who was touched by Valyria's curse, though she never went there herself. Her name was Rhaenyra Targaryen, and she lived nearly a century after Aerea's death. She was a princess, then a queen, and her story ended in tragedy just as Aerea's did. Rhaenyra never flew to Valyria. She never tried to reclaim the lost homeland. But she rode dragons, powerful dragons, and she believed in the strength of her house. She believed that Targaryens were special, that they were protected by their blood, that dragons made them invincible. She went to war with that belief, fighting for her right to rule, and she lost everything. Her story is different from Aerea's in many ways, but it carries the same lesson. Dragons are not enough. Power is not enough. The Targaryens are not invincible. They are human, and humans die. And sometimes the things that make them special, their dragons, their blood, their legacy, are exactly what destroy them. Aerea claimed Balerion seeking freedom and power, and it killed her. Rhaenyra claimed the Iron Throne seeking her birthright, and it killed her. Both were princesses who refused to accept the limits placed on them. Both were brave, both were determined, and both died horribly, consumed by the very things they thought would save them. The ruins of Valyria cast a long shadow. They remind us that even the greatest civilizations fall. Even the most powerful families can be destroyed. Even dragons, those symbols of eternal might, can die. And perhaps most importantly, they remind us that some knowledge comes at too high a price. Aerea paid that price. She saw what was in Valyria, and it killed her. She brought back creatures from nightmare, things that should never have left the ruins. She died in agony, her body used as a vessel for horrors that defied understanding. And in doing so, she taught the Targaryens a lesson they should have learned from the doom itself. Do not go back. Do not seek what was lost. Do not believe that you are special enough, strong enough, protected enough to reclaim what the world has taken away. Some doors, once closed, should stay closed. Some ruins should remain untouched. Some mysteries should be respected, not solved. That is Aerea's legacy, not the horror of her death, though that is what history remembers. Her legacy is the warning she gave, written in her suffering and carved into the memory of her family. She showed the Targaryens the limits of their power. She showed them that dragons are not enough. She showed them that Valyria is gone, and it should stay gone. And for a while they listened. For generations after Aerea, no Targaryen flew east. No dragon rider sought the smoking sea. They stayed in Westeros, built their kingdom, focused on the present rather than the past. They honored Valyria in words and songs and names, but they did not try to reclaim it. But memories fade, lessons are forgotten, and eventually, people start to wonder if the old stories were exaggerated. They start to think that maybe it was not as bad as everyone said. Maybe the dangers were overstated. Maybe, with modern knowledge and better preparation, someone could succeed where the ancients failed. And that is when tragedy strikes again. That is when someone like Garyon Lannister sails east with confidence and hope, certain that he will be the one to succeed. That is when the ruins claim another victim, when the smoking sea swallows another ship, when Valyria proves that its curse is real and lasting and patient. The ruins wait. They have waited for centuries. They will wait for centuries more. And whenever someone grows arrogant enough, curious enough, desperate enough to try their luck, the ruins will be there, ready to swallow them whole, ready to add another name to the long list of those who vanished into the smoking sea and never returned. Aerea Targaryen's name heads that list. She was not the first to die because of Valyria. The doom itself killed thousands, hundreds of thousands, entire generations of Valyrians. But she was the first to show what the ruins had become after the doom. She was the first to bring back proof that Valyria was not just destroyed but transformed into something worse than death. Her story is a tragedy because she was a child who deserved better. But it is also a warning, a message written in pain and horror, meant for anyone who comes after. The message is simple: stay away from Valyria. Do not seek the ruins. Do not believe you can reclaim what was lost. The glory of the freehold is gone. All that remains is danger and death and creatures that should not exist. Learn from Aerea. Learn from Garyon. Learn from Orion and all the others whose names we no longer remember, who vanished into the smoking sea and left nothing behind. Some places are cursed, not by magic or gods, but by their own history, by the weight of what they were and what they became. Valyria is such a place, and it should be left alone. That is the final lesson of Aerea Targaryen's tragedy. Not just that she died horribly, not just that she suffered beyond imagination, but that her suffering had meaning if we are wise enough to hear it. The ruins of Valyria are forbidden. They have always been forbidden. They will always be forbidden. And anyone who ignores that warning, anyone who believes they are special enough, or strong enough, or clever enough to succeed where everyone else failed, will end up like Aerea, burning from within, consumed by things that should not exist, dying in agony far from home, with no hope of rescue or relief. That is the price of curiosity. That is the cost of ambition. That is what happens when you refuse to accept that some doors should stay closed. Remember Aerea Targaryen. Remember her courage and her suffering. Remember the girl she was and the horror she became. And remember the lesson she taught, written in her own flesh and blood. Valyria is lost. Let it stay lost. This is the story of Aerea Targaryen, and the story of everyone who followed her into the darkness. The most disturbing tragedy in Game of Thrones, made more disturbing by the fact that it keeps happening, that people keep trying, that the ruins keep winning. May we be wiser than those who came before. May we hear the warnings and heed them. May we let the dead rest, and the ruins remain ruined, and the mysteries of Valyria stay mysterious, because some questions, when answered, destroy the ones who asked them. And Aerea Targaryen's final gift to the world was to ask those questions for us, to pay the price for us, to show us what awaits in the smoking sea, so that we never have to go there ourselves. This is her story. This is her warning. This is her legacy. Remember it well.